3.5 million square feet. That's how big the Packard automotive plant was at its peak. 80 buildings, 80 acres, 6 stories high in places. The first reinforced concrete factory ever built in America. In 1943, 41,000 men and women walked through these gates every single morning. Enough people to fill a baseball stadium. They built luxury cars so beautiful, so perfectly engineered, that presidents drove them. Movie stars, foreign royalty, the Japanese imperial family. For over 50 years, the name Packard meant one thing: the absolute pinnacle of American manufacturing. When you said, "Ask the man who owns one," their famous slogan, you didn't need to say anything else. Everyone knew. In 2013, the entire Packard plant sold for $405,000. Let me say that again. 3.5 million square feet, 80 buildings. The birthplace of over 1.6 million automobiles. The plant that helped win 2 world wars. $405,000. Your grandfather might have worked here. Your great-uncle. Your neighbor's father. Someone you knew bought a Packard and kept it running for 30 years because it was built to last forever. This wasn't planned obsolescence. This was American craftsmanship. Today, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan calls the Packard plant a source of national embarrassment. But it didn't start that way. It started with one man, one insult, and one promise that would change American industry forever. It started in 1899 in a small town in Ohio, when a young electrical engineer named James Ward Packard bought a car that kept breaking down. When he complained to the manufacturer, a man named Alexander Winton, Winton told him something he would regret for the rest of his life. "If you're so smart," Winton sneered, "why don't you build a better car yourself?" James Ward Packard looked at him and said, "Why, Mr. Winton, I guess I'll do just that." And he did. Within a decade, Packard was building the finest automobiles in America. Within 2 decades, they were outselling Cadillac and Lincoln. Within 3 decades, they were employing tens of thousands, operating in 61 countries, and defining what luxury meant. And then it all fell apart. This is the story of how America built the best cars in the world, and then lost everything. This is the story of 41,000 jobs, of families that worked here for 3 generations, of a company that survived the Great Depression but couldn't survive the 1950s. This is the story of the Packard Motor Car Company, the luxury brand that lost its way, the factory that became America's largest ruin. This is the story of promises broken, pensions lost, and an American dream that died on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit, Michigan. But it didn't start this way. It started with one man who refused to accept that American cars couldn't be the best in the world. It started with an insult and a promise. Warren, Ohio, 1899. Population, barely 20,000. This is where James Ward Packard and his brother William Dowd Packard ran a successful electrical equipment company. The Packard brothers weren't rich, but they were smart. James had graduated from Lehigh University with a degree in mechanical engineering, where he held patents. He understood how things worked, and more importantly, how to make them work better. In 1898, James did what any forward-thinking American with money in his pocket would do. He bought one of those newfangled horseless carriages. A Winton. Cost him $1,000, about $35,000 in today's money. It broke down constantly. So James, being an engineer, wrote to Alexander Winton with detailed suggestions about how to improve the design. Winton, being arrogant, told him where he could shove his suggestions. The exact quote is lost to history, but the sentiment is clear. If you think you can do better, build your own damn car. Most people would have let it go, written an angry letter, demanded their money back. James Ward Packard wasn't most people. On November 6, 1899, in a small workshop at 408, Dana Street Northeast in Warren, Ohio, the first Packard automobile rolled out. Model A, single-cylinder engine, chain drive, tiller steering. It looked like every other horseless carriage of the era, but it didn't drive like them. James Packard had solved the problems that plagued early automobiles: better lubrication, stronger drive shafts, more reliable ignition. The Packard Model A didn't just run, it ran smoothly, quietly, consistently. Word spread fast in the small world of automobile enthusiasts. In 1901, a wealthy Detroit investor named Henry Bourne Joy bought a Packard. He loved it so much he tracked down the Packard brothers in Ohio and made them an offer: his money and his business connections, in exchange for moving the company to Detroit and letting him run it. The Packard brothers, who were engineers, not businessmen, said yes. On October 2, 1902, the Packard Motor Car Company was officially incorporated. By March 1903, construction began on a revolutionary new factory on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. And when I say revolutionary, I mean it literally changed American industry forever. The architect was a 34-year-old immigrant's son named Albert Kahn. He proposed something nobody had ever attempted: a factory built entirely of reinforced concrete. Not brick, not wood. Concrete reinforced with steel. Why? Because concrete wouldn't burn, wouldn't collapse, could support massive weight, could be built taller with wider spans between columns, allowing for more efficient production lines. The Packard Plant was the first reinforced concrete automobile factory in America. It would become the prototype for every major factory built in the 20th century. Albert Kahn would go on to design Ford's River Rouge complex, GM's plants, factories across the Soviet Union. But it started here, with Packard, in 1903. The Packards understood something fundamental. You can't build the best cars in America in a second-rate factory. Those first years were precarious. The Packards discovered early engineering flaws, drive shaft failures, lubrication problems, and rather than cover them up, they bought back every single defective car and scrapped them. 25 cars, thousands of dollars in losses. But it established something more valuable than profit: trust. They didn't need fancy advertising, though their slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," coined later by company president James Alvin McCauley, would become legendary. They had something better: customers who wouldn't shut up about how good their cars were. By 1910, Packard was building multiple models, employing hundreds, expanding the factory. They weren't the biggest automobile company. Ford was mass-producing the Model T, GM was consolidating brands. But Packard wasn't trying to build cars for everyone. They were building cars for people who wanted the best. In 1915, Packard introduced the Twin Six, America's first 12-cylinder engine. Smooth as silk, powerful as hell. It was a technical marvel. Over 100,000 Twin Six engines sold. It cemented Packard's reputation as the American luxury car. If you were a doctor, a lawyer, a successful businessman in 1920s America, you drove a Packard. Not a Ford, that's what factory workers drove. Not a Buick, that was middle management. A Packard meant you'd made it. The 3 Ps of Motordom royalty: Packard, Peerless, Pierce Arrow. That was the company Packard kept. By the late 1920s, the Packard plant covered 40 acres and employed thousands. The company was opening plants in Philadelphia, expanding to Canada, selling cars in 61 countries. In 1928, Packard posted revenues of $21.8 million, about $370 million in today's money. Profit? Solid. Reputation? Unassailable. Future? Bright. If you worked at Packard in 1928, you had every reason to believe this job would last your entire career, that your sons would work here, that your grandchildren would retire from here. You had every reason to believe in the American dream. Packard had done what James Ward Packard promised, that arrogant man in Ohio. They'd built a better car. The best car. An American car that could compete with Rolls-Royce, with Mercedes, with any luxury automobile in the world. For decades, it seemed like it would last forever. It didn't. Let me tell you what it meant to own a Packard in the 1930s. It meant your car had an inline-8 engine, or if you were really wealthy, a V12, that purred so quietly you could barely hear it running. It meant hand-stitched leather seats, real wood dashboards, chrome that was actually chrome, not plastic pretending to be metal. It meant that when you pulled up to a restaurant, the valet's eyes widened. It meant your neighbors knew you'd succeeded. It meant something. The Twin Six, introduced in 1915, was the car that made Packard's reputation. 12 cylinders in a V configuration. The engine was so smooth that Packard's chief engineer could balance a coin on edge on the running engine. Try that with your Ford. Over 100,000 Twin Sixes sold before Packard retired the model. It powered everything from luxury sedans to ambulances to the first transcontinental automobile trip. But here's where the story gets complicated, and where, in hindsight, you can see the first cracks forming. In 1935, in the depths of the Great Depression, Packard introduced the Packard 120. A cheaper Packard. Still luxury, still quality. But priced to compete with Buick and Chrysler, not just Cadillac and Lincoln. It saved the company. In 1937, Packard sold 109,518 cars, a record they would never break. The 120 was a hit, but it diluted the brand. See, when everyone can afford a Packard, it's not really a Packard anymore. The ultra-wealthy started looking elsewhere. To Duesenberg, to custom coach builders, to European marques. If your doctor drove a Packard 120, why would you buy a Packard 12? Packard was trying to be two things at once, exclusive and accessible. In the long run, you can't be both. But in 1937, nobody was thinking about the long run. They were thinking about 109,000 cars sold. They were thinking about 40 acres of factory floor operating at capacity. Packard held over 200 patents by the 1940s. They pioneered the modern transmission, improved electrical systems, advanced engine cooling. When Packard introduced the Ultramatic automatic transmission in 1949, it was one of the first fully automatic transmissions in America. During World War I, Packard built Liberty aircraft engines. During World War II, they built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. The same engines that powered the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war over Europe. Packard didn't just build cars. They built precision machinery for the war effort. They proved American manufacturing could compete with anyone, anywhere. The advertising was brilliant. "Ask the man who owns one" became more than a slogan. It became a cultural touchstone. Packard didn't need to tell you their cars were good. They knew that satisfied owners would do it for them. Clark Gable drove a Packard. Multiple U.S. presidents used Packard for official motorcades. The Japanese imperial family owned Packards. In 1930, if you counted the world's most powerful and wealthy individuals, a staggering percentage drove Packards. This wasn't just a car company. This was American prestige on wheels. By the 1940s, the Packard plant had grown to over 80 buildings, 3.5 million square feet, 80 acres, some buildings 6 stories high. Let me give you some perspective on that size. Disneyland, the entire theme park, is 85 acres. The Packard plant was nearly as large as Disneyland. Except instead of rides and cotton candy, it was concrete and steel and the coordinated labor of tens of thousands of human beings building the most complex consumer product of the era. The plant had its own fire department. its own hospital, its own brass band. It wasn't just a factory, it was a self-contained industrial city. At peak production in 1937, Packard was building over 6,000 cars per month. That's 200 cars per day. Every day. Engines, transmissions, bodies, interiors, paint, all manufactured in-house right here on East Grand Boulevard. The machinery was cutting edge. Stamping presses that could shape steel with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Paint booths that could handle 20 cars at once. Assembly lines that Henry Ford himself studied and admired. But here's what made Packard different from Ford. Packard never fully embraced mass production the way Ford did. There was still craftsmanship. Workers who specialized in one component and took pride in getting it perfect. Hand fitting. Quality control that rejected anything less than flawless. A Ford rolled off the line every minute. A Packard took time. And that time, that attention to detail, is what made it a Packard. The sounds of the plant, the rhythmic pounding of presses, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the rumble of engines being tested, the shouts of foremen, the bells signaling shift changes. Old-timers who worked there describe it like a symphony, loud, chaotic, but if you knew what to listen for, it all made sense. Every sound meant progress. Every sound meant jobs. Every sound meant America building something real. During World War II, the plant ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. The factory never slept. Aircraft engines for the war effort poured out of buildings that normally made luxury sedans. Packard workers knew their engines were going into Mustangs fighting over Germany. That meant something. That mattered. Imagine East Grand Boulevard at midnight in 1943. 80 buildings lit up like daylight. Thousands of workers streaming in for night shift. The parking lots full. The streets clogged with buses bringing workers from across Detroit. The lunch carts doing business at 2 a.m. The whole neighborhood alive, humming, producing. That was American manufacturing at its absolute peak. In 1943, 41,000 people worked at the Packard plant in Detroit. 41,000. Let that sink in. A single company. A single plant. 41,000 jobs. In the 1940s, a Packard assembly line worker made about $1.50 an hour. That's roughly $28 an hour in 2024 money. Working 48 hours a week, standard back then, that's about $67,000 a year. For a job that required a high school education and a willingness to work hard. With that paycheck, you could buy a house. Not rent, buy. A 3-bedroom house with a yard in a decent neighborhood for about $4,000. That's roughly 3 years' salary. Today, the average American house costs about 4 to 5 times the median annual income. And that's if you can save a down payment. But in 1945, if you worked at Packard, you could walk into a bank, show them your pay stubs, and walk out with a mortgage. Because banks knew Packard jobs were stable. Packard wasn't going anywhere. You could support a family on one income. Your wife didn't have to work unless she wanted to. Your kids could go to good public schools. You could save for retirement. Take a week's vacation, paid vacation because your union contract guaranteed it, at a lake up north. You could buy a car. Maybe not a Packard, those were still expensive, but a Ford or Chevy, pay cash. This is what we mean when we talk about the American dream. Not billionaires and mansions, just work hard, support your family, retire with dignity. That dream was real at Packard. For decades, it was real. The United Auto Workers organized Packard in 1937, part of the great wave of industrial unionization. By the 1940s, the UAW contract at Packard guaranteed. The UAW wasn't perfect. We'll get to the strikes later. But they delivered something fundamental. Dignity. You weren't a disposable cog. You were a worker with rights, with representation, with a voice. Management had to negotiate, had to listen, had to treat you like a human being whose labor had value. Packard had a company culture that's almost unimaginable today. They sponsored baseball teams, gym bowling leagues, a brass band that performed at community events, annual picnics where thousands of workers and their families showed up. It was common, normal, for multiple generations of the same family to work at Packard. Your grandfather started in the 1920s. Your father started in the 1940s. You started in the 1950s, expecting to retire in the 1980s. That's what stability looked like. That's what loyalty looked like. From both sides. You gave Packard your labor and your years. Packard gave you a livelihood and security. The plant had a full medical facility. Company doctors. If you got hurt on the job, and in a factory with stamping presses and molten metal, people got hurt. You got treated immediately. You got workers' compensation. You kept your job. Listen to how workers from that era describe it. We were proud of every car we built. You'd see a Packard on the street and you'd think, I helped make that. That mattered. 3 generations of my family worked at Packard. My grandfather, my father, me. I thought my son would too. That was the plan. The plant was the heartbeat of the East Side. When Packard was running strong, the whole neighborhood was alive. Churches were full. Shops were busy. Kids had new shoes for school. The plant didn't just employ 41,000 workers. It supported an entire ecosystem. The diners that fed workers on lunch break, the bars where they stopped after shift, the grocery stores where their wives shopped, the car dealerships where they bought Fords and Chevys with their Packard paychecks, the movie theaters, the barbershops, the tailors. Steaks economists estimate that every manufacturing job supports about 4 to 5 additional jobs in the community. 41,000 Packard jobs meant over 200,000 people whose livelihoods were directly or indirectly tied to that plant. 200,000 people. In a city of about 1.8 million in 1950, that's more than 10% of Detroit's entire population dependent on Packard. Packard's payroll taxes, property taxes, and the income taxes of its workers funded Detroit's schools, police, fire departments, roads, parks. When Packard was thriving, Detroit was thriving. The company contributed to local hospitals, libraries, community centers. Not out of charity, out of self-interest. Healthy, educated communities produced better workers. Strong neighborhoods meant stable families. It was a virtuous cycle. 3 times a day, at shift change, East Grand Boulevard transformed. Thousands of workers heading home, thousands more heading in. Traffic jams of people with jobs, lines at the bus stops, crowds at the gates. It must have been something to see. Controlled chaos, industrial choreography, proof that American capitalism, tempered by strong unions and decent management, could actually work for working people. For about 30 years, from the mid-1920s to the mid-1950s, Packard workers had something that seems almost mythical now: economic security. Not wealth, not luxury, just security. The knowledge that if you showed up, did your job, didn't cause trouble, you'd be okay. Your family would be okay. Your future was okay. By 1950, the Packard plant was one of the largest industrial facilities in the world. Over 1.6 million automobiles had been built there since 1903. Millions of engines, billions of parts. Proof that American workers, given decent wages and decent treatment, could outproduce anyone on Earth. This was the golden age. But golden ages don't last forever. And for Packard, the end was already beginning. The Great Depression should have killed Packard. In 1930, just 2 years after posting nearly $22 million in revenue, Packard's profits dropped to $9 million. In 1931, they posted their first annual loss, $2.8 million in the red. When the stock market crashed, Luxury car sales collapsed. The wealthy were trying to not look wealthy. Conspicuous consumption was suddenly gauche. Packard's natural customer base, doctors, lawyers, successful businessmen, were either broke or pretending to be. The Pierce Arrow, one of the three Ps, would be dead by 1938. Peerless stopped making cars in 1932. The luxury car market was a bloodbath, but Packard survived. How? The Packard 120. The cheaper Packard. The one that diluted the brand but kept the lights on. They sold it to the upper middle class, people who'd never dreamed of owning a Packard before. It worked, for a while, but it set a precedent. When times get tough, move down market. Chase volume over prestige. Build more cars for less money rather than fewer cars for more. That strategy has killed almost every luxury brand that's tried it. After World War II, there was a brief surge. Servicemen came home with money saved. Factories converted back to civilian production. Pent-up demand exploded. Between 1945 and 1950, Packard sold cars as fast as they could build them. But competition was intensifying. General Motors had Cadillac, and GM's massive resources behind it. Ford had Lincoln. Chrysler introduced the Imperial. All of them were gunning for the luxury market. All of them had deeper pockets than independent Packard. And then there were the imports. Before the war, European luxury cars were rare in America. After the war, wealthy Americans who'd served in Europe came home wanting Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, Rolls-Royce. The real thing, not American interpretations. Packard's market was being squeezed from below by GM and Ford, and from above by European prestige. Meanwhile, Packard's factory, revolutionary in 1903, was nearly 50 years old by 1950. The concrete was cracking. The equipment was aging. Competitors were building newer, more efficient plants using modern techniques. Packard needed to invest billions in modernization. They didn't have billions. In 1952, Packard brought in a new president, James Nance. He came from Hot Point Appliances. He was a businessman, not a car guy. He was supposed to save Packard. He had ideas, big ideas. Idea number one, merge with Studebaker, another independent automaker struggling against the big three. Together, Nance thought, they could become the fourth full-line auto company, competing with GM, Ford, and Chrysler across all price points. On October 1, 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker. It was a disaster. Studebaker was in worse shape than Packard. They had aging plants, declining sales, massive pension obligations, and a dealer network that was collapsing. Packard thought they were merging with a partner. Instead, they'd bought an anchor. Studebaker's liabilities swamped Packard's balance sheet. Money that should have gone into modernizing Packard's plant went to keeping Studebaker alive. It was like a drowning man grabbing onto another drowning man. They both went under faster. Nance also pushed for radical redesigns. The 1955 Packards were supposed to be bold and modern. They looked desperate. The elegant, conservative styling that had defined Packard for 50 years was gone, replaced by chrome and fins and styling cues copied from GM. They didn't look like Packards anymore. Loyal customers didn't buy them. New customers didn't care. They bought Cadillacs. Worse, quality suffered. In the rush to cut costs and increase production, the hand-fitting and craftsmanship that made Packard special disappeared. The 1956 models had oil leaks, electrical problems, fit and finish issues that would have been unthinkable in the 1930s. Ask the man who owns one? By 1956, the man who owned one was asking for his money back. Labor relations deteriorated. In June 1948, the UAW called a half-day strike that extended when supplier strikes cut off parts. In August 1950, 8,000 Packard workers struck for 2 weeks over wages and pensions. The strikes were justified. Workers deserved decent pay and retirement security. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Every day the plant was idle, Packard lost money and market share it couldn't afford to lose. Management grew hostile to the union. The union grew suspicious of management. The trust that had built Packard's success evaporated. It became adversarial, bitter. The kind of labor management warfare that cripples companies. Both sides thought they were fighting for survival. Both sides were right, but neither side won. The first major layoffs came in 1954. Packard cut about 1,000 workers, then another 1,000 in early 1955, then more. Each round was announced as temporary adjustments. The workers would be called back when demand improves. Management said it every time. It was never temporary. Cadillac was selling over 140,000 cars a year. Lincoln about 50,000. Packard couldn't break 30,000. Packard dealers were closing. When customers can't find a dealer to service their car, they stop buying that brand. When dealers can't get parts or support, they switch to brands that can supply them. It's a vicious cycle. By 1956, Packard's dealer network had shrunk by over 40% from its 1950 peak. Nance tried everything. He approached American Motors about a merger. Talks collapsed. He tried to negotiate defense contracts to bring in cash. The Korean War had ended. The government wasn't buying. He tried to find buyers for Packard's assets. Nobody wanted them. Meanwhile, the physical plant was deteriorating. Deferred maintenance, broken equipment not replaced. Whole buildings shut down as production contracted. The fire department disbanded. The hospital closed. The brass band stopped playing. Workers knew. You always know. The rumors on the factory floor spread faster than any official announcement. They're liquidating inventory. They're selling machinery. They turned off heat in Building 12. My foreman said to start looking. The anxiety was crushing. You've worked here 20 years. You're 45 years old. Like you have a mortgage and 2 kids in school. What do you do if Packard closes? Where do you go? GM and Ford aren't hiring. They're automating. You're not young enough to retrain. You're not old enough to retire. You just wait and hope. And watch the company you gave your life to slowly bleed out. By early 1956, everyone knew the end was coming. The only question was when. The answer, June. The death blow came from an unexpected direction. American Motors. In early 1954, before the Studebaker merger, Packard had been in negotiations with Nash and Hudson, who were merging to form American Motors. The plan was to create a true fourth automaker, Packard, Nash, Hudson, with enough scale to compete with the Big Three. It almost happened. But George Romney, the president of American Motors, walked away at the last minute. He decided AMC was better off staying independent and focusing on compact cars, rather than linking up with Packard's luxury baggage. In hindsight, Romney was right. AMC survived into the 1980s. Packard was dead by 1958. But in 1954, that failed merger forced Packard into Studebaker's arms instead. And Studebaker was a sinking ship. After the merger, Packard discovered that Studebaker's finances were even worse than disclosed. Pension obligations were massively underfunded. The South Bend plant was hemorrhaging money. Labor contracts were unsustainable. Packard executives realized they'd been conned, but it was too late. The companies were merged. The balance sheets were combined. Packard's cash was being used to cover Studebaker's losses. Nance tried to salvage it. He begged banks for loans, pitched consolidation plans, promised the 1957 models would turn it around. Nobody believed him anymore. In August 1956, James Nance resigned. He'd been president for 4 years. In that time, Packard had merged with Studebaker, redesigned its entire line, hemorrhaged market share, and run out of money. He later said, We could have been the fourth full-line automaker. Maybe, but they weren't. By summer 1956, the Detroit plant was running at a fraction of capacity. Only a few thousand workers remained of the 41,000 wartime peak. Most buildings were dark. The assembly lines moved slowly, irregularly. The end was obvious to everyone. On June 25, 1956, Studebaker Packard announced that all Packard production would be moved from the Detroit plant to Studebaker's factory in South Bend, Indiana. At the East Grand Boulevard plant, 3.5 million square feet, 80 buildings, the birthplace of American luxury automobiles, was closing immediately. Workers showed up for their shift and found the notice, typed on company letterhead, effective today. The plant is closed. Severance details to follow. That's how 43 years of history ended. A memo on a bulletin board. I couldn't believe it. I'd worked there 19 years. They told us on a Tuesday. By Friday, the gates were locked. My father retired from Packard in 1953. He told me it was the best job he ever had. Secure, stable. I thought I'd retire from there too. I was 32 years old with 2 kids. What was I supposed to do? The foreman cried. I'd never seen him cry. He'd started at Packard in 1928. He was 61 years old. Too old to get hired anywhere else. Too young for Social Security. He lost everything. The media covered it, but not like you'd think. This wasn't front-page news. It was business section, page 3, another company closing, another few thousand jobs lost. It was becoming normal. The Detroit city government expressed concern and disappointment. They promised to explore options and support affected workers. They did nothing meaningful. They couldn't. What could they do? They couldn't force Packard to stay open. They couldn't subsidize a dying company. They were as helpless as the workers. Studebaker Packard's stock, already depressed, fell further. Investors knew the truth. Packard wasn't moving to South Bend. Packard was dying. South Bend would slap Packard nameplates on Studebaker bodies for a couple years. But they wouldn't be real Packards. The last real Packard was built in Detroit. The final weeks of production were surreal. Workers showed up knowing each day might be the last. Supervisors stopped enforcing rules. What were they going to do, fire people? The plant took on a haunted quality. Half the lights were off to save money. Whole sections sat empty. The workers who remained took pride in the last cars. If these were the final Packards ever built in Detroit, they were going to be good ones. Hand-fitted, quality-checked, built the way Packards were supposed to be built. Screw the bean counters. This was about legacy. The last Packard built in Detroit rolled off the line on June 25, 1956. The exact model isn't well documented. Records from those final days are sparse, but it was likely a Packard 400, a premium hardtop. Workers gathered to watch. Some took photographs. Others just stood quietly, staring at the car that represented the end of an era. Multiple accounts describe workers crying. Grown men who'd worked with molten metal and heavy machinery, who'd survived the Depression and 2 world wars, standing on the factory floor weeping. The final shift ended around 4:30 p.m. Workers clocked out, collected their tools, emptied their lockers. Some took souvenirs, small parts, company newsletters, anything to remember. They walked out through the gates for the last time. Security locked the gates behind them. Within days, chain-link fencing went up around the perimeter. No trespassing signs. The plant that had run 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, for over 50 years, went silent. The silence must have been eerie. After decades of pounding presses and roaring engines and shouted orders, East Grand Boulevard was quiet. Thousands of Packard workers flooded Detroit's unemployment offices in summer 1956. The system was overwhelmed. Wait times stretched to hours. Benefits were meager. nothing close to what they'd been earning. Severance packages varied wildly depending on seniority and position. The details weren't well publicized. Studebaker Packard wanted to avoid scrutiny. But based on worker accounts and union records, here's what it looked like. So if you'd worked at Packard for 20 years, you might have gotten 5 months severance. Sounds okay until you realize that's all you're getting. No ongoing support, no job placement, no retraining, just a check and a handshake and good luck. The pension situation was worse. Packard's pension fund was supposed to be secure. Workers had been promised defined benefits based on years of service and final salary. But the Studebaker merger complicated everything. When Studebaker Packard collapsed completely in the late 1950s, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be created until 1974. Workers who'd been promised pensions got fractions of what they were owed, if anything. Some workers who'd put in 30 years got pension checks of $50 a month. Try living on that. Others got nothing. The fund was depleted. Too many retirees, not enough money, no government backstop. The legal battles went on for years. By the time they were settled, many of the retirees had died. In 1958, Studebaker Packard started liquidating the Detroit plant's contents. Machinery, tools, office furniture, everything. Industrial auction companies moved in like vultures. Stamping presses that cost hundreds of thousands sold for thousands. Precision tools sold for scrap weight. Assembly line equipment that had built over 1 million cars sold to the highest bidder, which was usually a dealer buying it to resell overseas. A lot of that equipment went to Mexico, to South America, to Asia. American manufacturing capability literally boxed up and shipped to competitors. The irony was brutal. The machinery that built American jobs was being sold to build foreign jobs. Within months, for sale signs appeared in neighborhoods around the plant. Workers who couldn't make mortgage payments without their Packard paychecks tried to sell. But who was buying? The whole neighborhood was Packard workers. They were all in the same situation. Home values collapsed. Families sold at a loss or just walked away, letting banks foreclose. The plant itself sat empty. By the late 1950s, scavengers were breaking in to strip copper wire, brass fittings, anything with scrap value. Windows were smashed. Graffiti appeared. The slow decay began. Studebaker Packard tried to sell the property. No buyers. Who wanted 3.5 million square feet of obsolete factory in a declining city? The Packard name lingered for a couple more years. Studebaker slapped Packard badges on rebadged Studebakers built in South Bend through 1958. They were Packards in name only. Studebaker bodies, Studebaker engines, none of the craftsmanship or luxury that had defined the brand. Customers weren't fooled. Sales were pathetic. In 1958, Studebaker Packard dropped the Packard name entirely. After 59 years, one of America's most prestigious automotive brands simply ceased to exist. From James Ward Packard's first car in Warren, Ohio, to the final fraudulent Studebaker Packard rolling out of South Bend, Indiana. 59 years. 59 years of American craftsmanship, innovation, and pride. Gone. Where do you go when your factory closes? In 1956, if you were a Packard worker, your options were limited. GM and Ford weren't hiring. They were automating and consolidating. Chrysler was struggling. The other independents were dying. Manufacturing jobs across Detroit were disappearing, not appearing. Some workers found jobs at other auto plants. If you were young, skilled, and lucky, you might get hired at Ford's River Rouge or a GM facility. But you started at the bottom. Entry-level wages, no seniority, the pension clock reset to 0, and you took a pay cut. Always. The new job paid less than Packard, and you knew it would never pay what Packard used to pay. If you were over 45, forget it. Nobody wanted to hire a 50-year-old assembly line worker? Too old to train, too expensive to insure, too close to retirement? They'd hire a 25-year-old for less money and get 30 years out of him. This was the brutal calculus of American labor in the 1950s. Your experience meant nothing. Your decades at Packard meant nothing. You were too old. End of discussion. Michigan offered retraining programs for displaced workers. Well-intentioned, but mostly useless. They'd teach you basic bookkeeping or light electronics assembly. 6 weeks of classes, then you were on your own. Success rate? Abysmal. Most workers never found jobs in their retrained fields. The programs existed so politicians could say they were doing something. A lot of workers left Detroit entirely, moved to California, where aerospace was booming, moved south, where textile mills and new industries were opening, moved anywhere that promised jobs. They left behind family, friends, the only city they'd ever known. Because what choice did they have? Personal bankruptcies spiked in East Detroit in 1957 to 1958. Families who'd been solidly middle class were wiped out. The mortgage they could afford on a Packard salary was impossible on unemployment or a lower-wage job. Banks foreclosed. Families were evicted, possessions sold to pay debts. It was the Depression all over again, but localized, was invisible to the rest of America. The stress destroyed marriages, unemployment, financial ruin, loss of identity. It's more than most relationships can withstand. Divorce rates among displaced Packard workers were significantly higher than the Detroit average. Men who'd been providers, who'd defined themselves by their work, suddenly had nothing. The psychological damage was profound. Multiple studies have documented the health impacts of mass layoffs, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, early death. Workers who lost their jobs at Packard in their 50s often didn't make it to 70. The stress literally killed them. Meet Joseph Kowalski. Not his real name, but his story is real. It's a composite of multiple worker accounts. Joe started at Packard in 1934, age 20. By 1956, he'd worked there 22 years. He was a master machinist, skilled, reliable, proud of his work. He made $2.40 an hour, good money. He owned a home, had 2 kids in high school, was 4 years from his pension vesting. June 25, 1956. He lost his job. He was 42 years old. Too young to retire, too old to get hired. His severance lasted 6 months, then unemployment, then nothing. He couldn't find comparable work. He took a job at a hardware store for $1 an hour, lost the house, moved the family into a rental. His wife took a job as a waitress. The kids dropped out of school to work. Joe died in 1964 of a heart attack. He was 50 years old. His wife said the day Packard closed, Joe's spirit broke. He was never the same. That story, with minor variations, repeated thousands of times. In 1955, Detroit's unemployment rate was about 4.5%, essentially full employment. By 1958, it was over 12% in the census tracts surrounding the Packard plant. Over 12%. 1 in 8 people unable to find work. Detroit's population peaked in 1950 at about 1.85 million. By 1960, it had dropped to 1.67 million. By 1970, 1.51 million. The Packard closure was just one factor, but it was a significant one. When the jobs leave, people follow. The ecosystem around the plant collapsed. The diners that served Packard workers closed. No customers. The bars closed. The grocery stores, the barbershops, the tailors. One by one, for lease signs appeared, then broken windows, then boarded-up buildings. Local schools saw enrollment drop as families moved away. The tax base collapsed. Packard's property taxes alone had been a significant revenue source, plus the income taxes from thousands of workers. Schools cut programs. Class sizes grew. Building maintenance was deferred. The quality of education declined, making the neighborhood less attractive to families who could afford to leave. Another vicious cycle. Property values in the neighborhoods immediately around the plant fell by 30 to 40% between 1956 and 1960. Homes that sold for $12,000 in 1955 sold for $7,000 in 1960, if they sold at all. Families lost their equity, their nest eggs, their ticket to the middle class. As economic conditions deteriorated, crime rose. Burglaries, car thefts, drug dealing. The social fabric that held communities together, stable families, steady jobs, hope for the future, unraveled. Police presence increased, but it didn't help. You can't arrest your way out of economic devastation. Packard's closure triggered a cascade of failures among supplier companies. Dozens of small manufacturers who'd supplied parts exclusively to Packard went bankrupt within a year. Tool and die shops, upholstery suppliers, chrome platers, machine shops, each one employed dozens or hundreds of workers. Each closure multiplied the damage. Estimates suggest that Packard's closure directly or indirectly eliminated over 15,000 jobs beyond the plant itself. The plant became a symbol, a 3.5 million square foot monument to failure, to broken promises, to the death of American manufacturing. Detroiters drove past it every day, a constant reminder of what they'd lost. After Studebaker Packard abandoned it, the Packard plant changed hands multiple times. Each owner had big plans. None succeeded. From the 1960s through the 1990s, a company called Chemical Processing Incorporated operated in a small portion of the complex. They recycled automotive materials. It was a fraction of the plant's capacity, maybe 5% of the space in use. The other 95% rotted. Fires became common. Arson, mostly. Bored kids. Scrappers burning insulation off copper wire. Homeless people trying to stay warm. The Detroit Fire Department responded to hundreds of fires at the Packard plant over the decades. They stopped trying to save it. They just made sure it didn't spread to occupied buildings nearby. By the 1990s, the Packard plant had become an international destination for urban explorers. Photographers, artists, filmers. It was hauntingly beautiful in its decay. Nature reclaiming industrial space. Trees growing through floors. Bodies and graffiti covering walls. It was also incredibly dangerous. Floors collapsed. Ceilings fell. People died exploring the ruins. In 1998, a colorful character named Dominic Christini bought a section of the plant. He claimed he was going to redevelop it. The city was skeptical. Turns out they were right. Christini was using the plant to store stolen property. When police tried to enter, he barricaded himself inside for 8 months, armed, defiant, claiming the city had no right to evict him. It turned into a bizarre spectacle. Media camped outside. Christini gave interviews from inside the plant. He became a folk hero to some, a symbol of resistance against Detroit's decline. Eventually, SWAT teams forcibly removed him. He went to prison. The plant remained abandoned. In 2013, a Spanish developer named Fernando Palazuelo bought the Packard plant for $405,000. $405,000 for 3.5 million square feet. That's about 12 cents per square foot. In Detroit's modest real estate market at the time, developed land was selling for $10 to $20 per square foot. Palazuelo promised redevelopment, mixed-use space, art galleries, residential lofts, manufacturing. He released renderings, held press conferences. Nothing happened. The plant continued to decay. Palazuelo blamed financing, blamed the city, blamed contamination issues. The city grew impatient. In 2019, a pedestrian bridge connecting two Packard buildings collapsed into the street below. Miraculously, no one was killed. But it was a wake-up call. The structures were becoming genuinely hazardous. The city took control through tax foreclosure. Palazuelo fought it legally, but lost. By 2021, Detroit owned the Packard Plant again. In 2022, demolition finally began. Mayor Mike Duggan called the plant a source of national embarrassment and pledged to tear it down. Building by building, the wrecking crews moved in. The concrete that had stood for over a century came down in clouds of dust. By late 2024, most of the complex was gone. As of 2025, only 2 buildings remain standing. The city announced plans for Packard Park, a mixed-use redevelopment with light manufacturing, cultural spaces, and green space. Whether it happens remains to be seen. Detroit has announced a lot of plans over the years, and the site has significant environmental contamination: lead, petroleum, industrial chemicals from a century of manufacturing. Cleanup costs are estimated in the tens of millions. No Superfund designation, but it's a brownfield site requiring remediation before redevelopment. The American dream doesn't just die, it leaves toxic residue. Let's do the math on what the American dream used to mean. 1950. Packard assembly line worker, $2.40 per hour, 48-hour week. Annual income, roughly $6,000. Median home price in Detroit, $8,500. Ratio, 1.4 times annual income. 2024. Auto worker, if you can get hired, $28 per hour, 40-hour week. Annual income, roughly $58,000. Median home price in Detroit Metro, $220,000. Ratio, 3.8 times annual income. And that's Detroit, one of the cheapest major metro areas. Nationally, it's worse. The 1950 Packard worker could buy a house in 3 years, support a family on one income, save for retirement with a pension, take paid vacation, send kids to decent public schools. The 2024 auto worker, if they're lucky enough to have that union job, needs 2 incomes, struggles to save a down payment, has a 401k instead of a pension, and worries constantly about layoffs and plant closures. This is what was lost. Not just jobs, not just a factory, a social contract, an economic model that actually worked for working people. Modern auto plants employ a fraction of the workers Packard did. Automation, robotics, computers. A plant that would have employed 10,000 in 1950 employs 500 today. Higher productivity, lower costs, bigger profits for shareholders, and 4,500 families that used to be middle class are now, what? Service workers, gig economy, unemployed? In 1950, about 35% of American workers belonged to unions. Today, less than 11%, and only about 6% in the private sector. Unions weren't perfect. We'll be honest about that. But they delivered. You know the things we consider basic labor rights now? Unions fought for those. Often literally fought. Strikes, violence, deaths. And as unions declined, so did workers' share of economic growth. From 1948 to 1973, worker productivity and wages grew together, about 96% increase in both. From 1973 to 2023, productivity grew 77%. Wages grew 12%. The workers got more productive. The profits went to shareholders and executives. That's what changed after Packard, after the great American manufacturing collapse. Let's be clear about who killed Packard. Management made catastrophic decisions. The Studebaker merger, the failed AMC deal, the brand dilution with the 120, the styling disasters of the 1950s. the deferred investment in plant modernization. James Nance came from appliances. He didn't understand cars. He didn't understand luxury. He tried to make Packard compete on volume when Packard's strength was exclusivity. Wall Street didn't help. The pressure for quarterly profits over long-term investment killed American industry. Packard needed to invest billions in modernization in the 1940s. That would have hurt short-term profits, so they didn't do it. By the time they had to, they couldn't afford it. Trade policy destroyed American manufacturing. Not immediately, not directly, but over decades. The bipartisan consensus that free trade would benefit everyone destroyed the industrial base. Capital is mobile. Factories can move. Workers can't. When companies can close an American plant and open a Mexican plant paying a fifth of the wages, with no environmental regulations, no unions, no benefits, what do you think happens? We're all complicit. Americans wanted cheap goods. We chose Walmart over the local store. We chose price over quality. We chose disposable products over things built to last. A Packard cost more than a Chevy. It lasted longer. It was better. But most people chose cheap. And once cheap became the expectation, there was no going back. Did unions play a role? Yes. Honest answer, yes. The 1948 and 1950 strikes came at terrible times. Some union demands were unrealistic given Packard's declining position. Adversarial labor relations made it harder to adapt. But here's the context. Workers were fighting for security that management was already planning to take away. They knew the company was in trouble. They were trying to protect themselves. Were they supposed to just accept wage cuts and layoffs quietly? The truth is, there's no single villain. It was systemic failure, management short-sightedness, Wall Street pressure, trade policy, technological change, changing consumer preferences, union rigidity, government inaction. All of it together killed Packard, killed Detroit, killed American industrial dominance. Vintage Packards are collector items now. A pristine 1930s Packard 12 can sell for over $1 million at auction. A nice Twin 6, $200,000 plus. There's an active collector community. Car clubs, annual meets, how people who maintain these cars with reverence as artifacts of a lost era. The Packard Motor Car Foundation in Warren, Ohio, where it all started, preserves the company's history. They have a museum, archives. They work to keep the Packard story alive. Because if we forget this history, we're doomed to repeat it. Actually, scratch that, we are repeating it. Right now. Boeing moving production, steel mills closing, automotive plants relocated to Mexico, tech companies outsourcing. It's still happening. The pattern continues. The promises are the same. Globalization will lift all boats. Free trade creates prosperity. Technology will create new jobs. And workers keep losing. Packard was one factory. Detroit had dozens more. The Rust Belt has thousands. Fisher Body, Studebaker, Bethlehem Steel, RCA, Westinghouse, General Electric, Shitty, all of them gone or gutted. Every closure has the same story. Workers blindsided, communities devastated, promises broken, profits extracted. Politicians promise to bring back manufacturing. Both parties, every election, it hasn't happened, it won't happen. Not the way it was. Because the economic model that made Packard possible, strong unions, regulated trade, high wages, companies investing in workers and communities, that's gone. Dismantled. By design. Today's worker doesn't have a Packard job. They have 3 part-time gigs with no benefits. They have contract work with no security. They have a 401k they can't afford to contribute to instead of a pension. They have the freedom to work themselves to death without ever achieving the security their grandparents had. That's progress? This is East Grand Boulevard today. Where 80 buildings once stood, where 41,000 people once worked, where over 1.5 million cars were once built, there's mostly empty land now. 2 buildings remain, stripped, gutted, windows gone, graffiti covered, waiting for demolition or redevelopment, whichever comes first. You can walk the perimeter. The fences keep you out, but you can see through them. Broken concrete, rebar jutting from the ground, piles of rubble, weeds growing through everything. If you look carefully, you can still find pieces. A section of terrazzo flooring with the Packard logo, fragments of decorative ironwork, chunks of that revolutionary reinforced concrete, still solid after 120 years. The graffiti tells its own story. Some of it is art, murals of Detroit's rise and fall, tributes to the workers, political statements. Some of it is just tags, names, claims of territory over a ruin. Nature is taking it back. Trees growing where assembly lines ran, birds nesting in the ruins. In a generation, if nothing is built here, it'll be a forest. The plant will disappear completely. Maybe that's appropriate. Let the earth reclaim what industry abandoned. Occasionally, former workers come back. Old men now, in their 80s or 90s. They stand at the fence, staring at where they used to work. I started in 1947, one told a documentary crew in 2019. Worked in Building 10, engine assembly. I was 19 years old. I thought I'd retire from here. Thought my son would work here. Thought Packard would be here forever. He paused, looking at the ruins. Forever wasn't as long as we thought. The neighborhoods around the plant are slowly recovering. Some. Young people moving back to Detroit. Gentrification creeping in. New businesses. The city government's invested in some redevelopment projects. But the recovery is uneven, patchy, and it's not bringing back the kind of jobs that built the middle class. The city's latest plan calls for Packard Park, mixed-use development, light manufacturing, green space, cultural center. It sounds nice. It might even happen. But it won't employ 41,000 people. It won't support 200,000 people's livelihoods. It won't recreate the economic ecosystem that Packard created. That's gone. Forever. There's a strange beauty to the site at sunset. The light hits the remaining buildings, and for a moment, you can almost see it. The ghost of what was. The industrial cathedral that once stood here. While you can almost hear the presses pounding, the engines roaring, the workers calling to each other across the vast floor. Almost. The Packard logo, the family crest, the elegant script. You can still find it if you look. Carved into stone, cast into metal, embossed on fragments. Ask the man who owns one. The man who owned one is probably dead now. His Packard, if it survived, is in a museum or a collector's garage, a relic. This is what's left of the American dream. This empty lot in Detroit. This monument to what we built and what we lost. Packard made the best cars America ever produced. They employed thousands. They built communities. They proved that American workers, given decent wages and decent treatment, could build anything. And then it ended. Not because it had to, but because we let it. Remember this. Remember them. Remember what we lost. And ask yourself, how do we make sure it never happens again? Because it's still happening. Right now. Somewhere in America, another factory is closing. Another community is dying. Another generation is learning that loyalty means nothing, that promises are worthless, that the American dream was just that, a dream. If this story affected you, if it made you angry or sad or nostalgic for an America that actually built things, then we've done our job. But here's the thing. There are hundreds of factories just like this one, all across America, with stories that need to be told. From Pennsylvania steel mills to North Carolina textile plants, from California aerospace to Wisconsin paper mills, this pattern repeats. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We're covering the Fisher body plant next. Another Detroit tragedy, another broken promise. And if you want to support this research, the link is in the description. These videos take weeks to produce, hundreds of hours of research, writing, and editing, but they're worth it to preserve this history, to honor the workers who built America, to remember what we lost. Drop a comment. What American company do you want us to cover next? What factory closure destroyed your town? Share your story. This is history that mainstream media ignores, history that politicians want forgotten, history that matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. They built the best cars in the world. They deserved better. We all deserved better.